There are some very questionable vexillological practices going on across Canada. From bizarre design choices to the aesthetically dated, to breaking all the laws of color, flags, and the study of them, vexillology. But out of all the flags of the many Canadian provinces, territories, municipalities, movements, cities, etc., none of them can hold a candle to the absolute design nightmare that is the flag of Lethbridge, Alberta. Just look at it. What is this? Who thought this was a good idea? What's going on here? Well, dear viewer, grab a snack, something to drink, because it's a whole story. Before we get into the backstory, let's look at the whole whoop-up flag itself. Yes, that's right. It's called the whoop-up flag. I'll get into that later. Where to start on this monstrosity? It's a 1x2 proportioned American flag knockoff consisting of 7 red and 6 white horizontal stripes of varying sizes. In the upper left is a canton of navy blue, with 14 white stripes and cubes laid out in some kind of an order that I can't really discern. It's an affront to graphic design in every capable aspect, an abomination in the face of vexillology, and yet is completely unignorable. And if you think this is a grotesque unicorn in the flag world, well, let me present to you the 1846 flag of Fort Lewis in Montana. Yeah, looks kinda similar and equally as grotesque, right? The rough cutout of the white stripes in the upper right canton, and the horizontal stripes that we can assume are red and white. It seems like if you had an independent trading fort back in the day, you could commit all kinds of vexillological crimes. So now that you understand it's pretty common to fly a homemade flag in the 19th century, you might ask yourself why the city decided to not once, but twice revive and keep this flag. And it all comes down to the significance of the flag itself in Canadian history. It's 1821. The Northwest and Hudson Bay companies both agree to a ceasefire forced by the British government, ending the Canadian corporate fur trader wars. This merger allows a further expansion west and competition from the American Fur Company. The border between Canada and the United States had been established in 1818, but in the territories west of present-day Ontario, there was little to no government presence. Companies and traders would routinely skip across the border if it seemed lucrative. By the 1840s, the Hudson's Bay Company had destroyed the American Fur Company's reach in the West, thanks to its monopolistic power. That, of course, left a power vacuum in Montana that was filled by independent traders looking to make a quick buck. In the eyes of the Bay, these small forts were just a nuisance and nothing really to worry about. Soon, with their complete control of the West established, the HBC could refocus on its settlements around the Red River and let its forts in present-day Saskatchewan and Alberta languish. Once again, the independent forts saw an opportunity. In the 1850s, gold and wolf hides had become the resources to trade. The contractors would ride from Fort Benton in Montana through the Blackfoot Confederacy to poach and pan, and then into Fort Edmonton or Rocky Mountain House to trade. A stop in the middle sure seemed like a good idea. And after the USA decided to crack down on trading and selling of alcohol to indigenous people in Montana, it was time to move across the border. That brings us to 1869. John Healy and Alfred Hamilton are whiskey traders at Fort Benton and are affected by the new restrictive selling practices of the American government. They pony up the money to build a new fort north of the 49th parallel. Fort Hamilton is erected at the mouth of the Old Man and the St. Mary Rivers, where current-day Lethbridge resides. Rumors of the new fort started to flow into the ears of the Hudson's Bay agents, and they kept an eye on how the venture progressed. This is also the first non-Confederacy fort in Blackfoot lands, and they weren't all too happy about it. The Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika warriors decided to exercise their sovereignty and burn the roughly year-old fort to the ground in 1870. Completely undeterred, Healy and Hamilton build a second Fort Hamilton, this time with a crowd of lawless followers to help defend it. The second fort cemented its reputation in the history books. The Whiskey Fort was known for its brawls, murders, and general inebriated violence. The name was changed to reflect this, as folks would really whoop it up at the fort, according to the French traders that would visit. So, Fort Whoop Up got a new name to brand itself on. Now all they needed was a symbol. No one knows who made the flag or when it was made, or how many drinks the person had prior to sewing it, but this is the result. This majestic hodgepodge of fabric represented the lawless expansion of the American Republic into newly acquired Canadian territory. By 1871, the HBC was getting concerned. Not only was the fort thriving, it was being copied. Roughly 50 new trading forts were built in a short 2 years with names like Robber's Roost, Standoff, Kip, Farewell, Solomon, and Slideout. All of them mostly trading in whiskey or ethanol. The HBC started receiving letters from Archbishop Lacombe about his worries relating to the debauchery going on in southern Alberta, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Thanks to the sale of Rupert's Land to the Canadian government in 1869 and the Red River Rebellion keeping the Canadian Army busy, the West could no longer be controlled by the company, and wasn't going to be controlled by the government anytime soon. So by 1872, things were fully and truly out of hand. Nothing is being regulated, and the Canadian traders that did come to the fort now all know of its reputation and try to avoid it. Fort Whoopup's little American enclave sits alone, and little do they know, on a crash course with genocide. The main currency at the fort was pelts and furs. If you stacked them as high as a man, you got yourself some whiskey. In this case, it was the ethanol I had previously mentioned, mixed with spices and some kind of colorant to try to fool the people drinking it. The pelts that were really in high demand were wolf pelts. Wolves usually weren't killed by the locals, so when adventurous Americans discovered this, they had a field day. As time went on, these men would be known as the Wolfers, and would become some of the few bulk wolf pelt providers in Canada. Hunting wolves was fairly easy. The bison still existed in numbers in the Blackfoot Confederacy, so the Wolfers would shoot a bison, poison the meat, and wait for the scavengers to come rolling in. The next morning, all they would do was go collect the pelts off the poison wolves and sell them for a tidy profit and their weight in whiskey. Obviously, this didn't make the indigenous people very happy, and a state of tension existed between the Wolfers and the local indigenous confederacies. But something had to give, and the straw that broke the camel's back would be over some stolen horses. The Green River Renegades were a group of about a dozen American and Canadian wolfers who would hunt between Fort Benton and Fort Whoopup. In the spring of 1873, they were stationed about 200 kilometers outside of the Iron Confederacy's territory near Fort Benton. When they awoke, they found their horses gone. They made their way to a small whiskey outpost named Fort Farewell, looking for the thieves. Forts Farewell and Solomon were common stop-offs for wolfers and trappers when they were hunting in the Cypress Hills. It lays roughly on the border between the Iron and Blackfoot Confederacies and was a safe haven for anyone coming east from Fort Whoopup. John Evans and Thomas Hardwick, the leaders of the Renegades, met with another wolfer named George Hammond, whose horse had been stolen but returned. The three determined, without evidence I might add, that the Nakota that were camped to the south of Fort Solomon had to be the culprits. The owner, Abe Farewell, tried to convince them otherwise. The Nakota, led by Little Soldier, were upstanding customers, and people who weren't into stealing horses. But the Renegades weren't listening. Both Little Soldier's camp and the Green River Renegades filled themselves with whiskey that night, having no idea the issue that the hangover would cause in the morning. The dawn came, and once again, George Hammond's horse went missing. All nursing brutal hangovers and drinking more to alleviate the headaches, they made their way out to Little Soldier's camp to parley. At the camp, a very drunk Little Soldier had no idea what they were talking about. He hadn't stolen any horses, nor did he want to. In fact, the Wolfers could borrow the Nakota's horses until they found theirs, if it was that much of an issue. That offer wasn't good enough, and both sides got ready for battle. As the Wolfers gathered together to decide their plan of attack, Abe Farewell rode out in between the groups to dissuade them from starting a fight. It was unfortunately too little, too late. A shot rang out, and immediately Little Soldier's warriors started a flanking maneuver. For a moment, it looked like the Renegades would be enveloped and killed when a Canadian wolfer named Ed Grace took another man from the nearby forts and rode out to assist. He was killed almost instantly, being the only casualty on the side of the wolfers. His death started a retreat back to the neighboring Fort Solomon, where the Renegades could fire into the camp safely behind the walls. The Nakota had no answer back to this, and ran and took refuge into the hills. The wolfers eventually made their way back to the Nakota camp to pillage it, only to find Little Soldier still there defending it. He was drunk and unfortunately was in no shape to fight. The wolfers had a French renegade named Vincent behead him, and his head was displayed as a warning message and a trophy. The women and children remaining in the camp were, well, I can't really say what happened to them on YouTube, but you can assume what happened to them. The renegades retreated to Fort Solomon to drink away their victory, and in the morning, the Nakota camp and 30 dead bodies that still lay on the battlefield were all burnt to a crisp. The body of Ed Grace was buried at Fort Solomon, and then the fort itself was burnt to the ground by the Wolfers. All Abe Farewell could do was look on in horror as his customers were killed, his neighbors were burnt to the ground, and Little Soldier's head was mounted on the walls of his outpost. The Green River Renegades would return to Fort Benton, never finding their horses, and be welcomed as Manifest Destiny incarnate. North of the border at Fort Whoop-Up, it was a different story. The massacre had rocked the government in Ottawa, so much that Prime Minister John A. Macdonald rushed a bill through that created the Northwest Mounted Rifles, later to be named the Northwest Mounted Police. The Green River Renegades and other participants of the Cypress Hill Massacre would all be brought to trial, and none of them would be convicted of a single crime. So when news got to Fort Whoop-Up that a 300-man column of police were headed their way, they rightfully panicked. On July 8, 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George French and his Northwest Mounted Police left Fort Dufferin in the new province of Manitoba. It would take 3 months and a detour into the United States to recruit legendary scout Jerry Potts before they came upon Fort Whoop-Up. The entire police march west was a disastrous ordeal, but that's a story for another time. When the column arrived, a policeman, James McLeod, approached the fort and was immediately let in by the only person left in it, an American trader named David Akers. The whiskey had been dumped or buried under the fort, the criminals had fled, and the pelts had been sold or taken. The fort financiers, Healy and Hamilton, were nowhere to be seen. The show of force had succeeded, and throughout the rest of the 1800s, the Northwest Mounted Police would clean up the province with the help of its citizens. So let's fast forward to 1967. Canada's Confederation Centennial was approaching, and designing a new flag was all the rage. After all, Canada had just procured a new flag in 1965. The town of Lethbridge wanted a flag of their own to hoist for this year's Whoop-Up Day. Think the Calgary Stampede or Edmonton's Klondike Days, but on a smaller scale. City Council approached Lethbridge historian Alex Johnston to research the town's history and find the flag of the original Fort Whoop-Up. This is what he pitched, and they ate it up. The flag was raised proudly over the outlook of where Fort Whoop-Up once stood, and is still there today. The successors of the Northwest Mounted Police, the modern-day RCMP, would be on site for the raising of the flag they took down some 90 years prior. In 1971, due to overwhelming support, the Whoop-Up flag would be adopted as the official flag of Lethbridge. In 1983 and 2005, Town Council thought about changing it, but never actually did, and it still flies proudly outside City Hall and all around the city. On one final note, in 2021, the RCMP ended a 135-year presence in Lethbridge, moving to the town of Coaldale and a newer facility. It truly was the end of an era for the town that brought government rule to Western Canada. Thanks for watching.